Camping Horror Stories. Story 1. By Jacob. I've always enjoyed camping alone. Not for the peace or the birdsong or any poetic crap like that. I like the distance. The silence between myself and the world. No buzzing phones, no traffic, no people brushing against you in stores. Just space. I'm a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend most of my time behind a screen. It messes with your head after a while. So every couple of months, I pack up my gear and head out to this remote spot in the Cascades. I don't give out the location, not even to friends, because I want it untouched. Pure. Private. It's a small clearing maybe 2 hours from the nearest trailhead, surrounded by thick pines, with a gentle slope down to a stream that's always ice cold, no matter the season. I've camped there at least a dozen times over the past 3 years. I know every inch of that place. So when I say the tent wasn't there when I arrived, I mean it. I got to the clearing late in the afternoon, around 5:30 p.m. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows, the kind that make you feel like you're being followed even when you're not. I set up camp like usual, pitched my tent, checked my supplies, gathered some dry branches. Nothing felt off. It wasn't until I went to collect water that I noticed it. About 50 feet from my site, just beyond a line of thick ferns, there was a tent. Tan canvas, older than mine, with a collapsed flap facing the stream. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw it. It didn't make sense. I would have seen it earlier. It was right there, in a direct line of sight from where I'd built my fire pit. But I'm not someone who jumps to conclusions. I figured someone else had just set up while I was busy making camp. Still, I hadn't heard a thing. No crunching leaves, no voices, no distant music. Nothing. I stood there for a while, just watching, listening. But it was quiet. Too quiet. After a few minutes, I cleared my throat loudly and called out, "Hey, just letting you know I'm camping up the hill." No response. I raised my voice. "Hello? You good over there?" Still nothing. Maybe they were asleep, I thought. Or out hiking. I filled my bottle at the stream, deliberately making a bit more noise than necessary, hoping it might stir whoever was in the tent. But as I passed it again on the way back to my own site, I couldn't help but glance over. The tent looked old. Not dirty exactly, but faded, like it had seen a lot of weather. The flap was unzipped just a bit, maybe 4 inches. Enough to see that it was dark inside. No movement. No gear outside.
No boots, no cooking supplies.
Just the tent. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined hearing footsteps. Leaves crunching. A zipper sliding open. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, but something about that tent put me on edge. Not fear exactly, more like a creeping alertness. Like when your brain won't let your body relax. Around midnight, I finally drifted off. But sometime later, I don't know how long, I woke up to the sound of soft, deliberate movement. Outside. I held my breath. It wasn't an animal. I've heard raccoons and deer rummage through campsites before. This was different. The steps were slow. Careful. Human. I sat up, heart pounding in my throat. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't want to grab it yet. I didn't want to make a sound. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a zipper, not mine, being pulled down. Not fast. Just a slow, steady unzipping. I froze. The sound stopped. Then silence. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. Maybe more. I couldn't hear anything now, just the blood rushing in my ears. And then, the faintest crunch of leaves. Closer now. Someone, or something, was walking toward my tent. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I barely breathed. The steps circled. Not right up to the tent, but close enough that I could hear every shift in weight on the ground. They were moving slowly, deliberately, not trying to be quiet, not trying to be loud, just walking. After what felt like forever, the steps faded, back into the trees. I waited, clutching my flashlight in both hands, until the first pale signs of morning leaked through the tent fabric. Only then did I unzip my door. No one was there. I stepped outside, legs stiff from tension, and looked down the hill toward the other tent. Gone. It wasn't there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, walked to the edge of the slope. Nothing. Just grass and dirt and a few scattered ferns. There were no drag marks, no footprints, no indication that a tent had ever been there at all. I stood there a long time, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't dreamed it. I knew what I saw. I remembered the zipper sound. the shadowed opening, the smell of old canvas. I even remembered the small metal ring where the front flap had been tied down. But now, nothing. I packed up my gear slowly. I didn't rush. I wasn't ready to admit I was spooked, even to myself. But when I looked at the patch of dirt where that tent had been, something inside me shifted. I started noticing small things. Like how the birdsong was absent. How the breeze seemed to avoid the clearing entirely. How even the stream felt quieter, like it was holding its breath. I didn't leave right away. I stayed one more night. Call it stubbornness or stupidity, I don't know. But I told myself I wasn't going to let a weird night ruin a spot I loved. That was a mistake. The second night was worse. It started just after dusk. I was sitting by the fire, eating from a pouch of freeze-dried chili, when I heard it. Snap. A branch, about 20 feet away, broken underfoot. I turned instantly, eyes scanning the tree-line. Nothing moved. But then another snap. This time closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and called out. "Who's there?" Silence. Then from behind me, on the opposite side of camp, another crack of wood. Then another. Closer. Closer. I spun around, heart in my throat. I flashed the light in every direction, but saw only trees. No eyes. No figures. But the sounds kept coming. Circling. Always staying just outside the firelight. Not random movement. Not animal noise. Steps. Measured. Human. I backed into my tent and zipped it shut, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. I waited again. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Then, just like the night before, the steps faded away. I didn't sleep. Not a second. At first light, I stepped outside. My fire had burned low, just embers now. Everything was exactly as I left it. Except for one thing. On top of my cooler, placed neatly and squarely, was a metal ring. The same kind I'd seen holding the flap on the other tent. It sat there in the morning sun, cold and still, like it had always belonged to me. I didn't touch it. I packed my gear faster than I ever had before, barely taking time to roll up my tent properly. I didn't eat. I didn't refill my water. I just left. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I kept listening for steps behind me. I never heard any. But at the last bend in the trail, just before the parking area came into view, I turned around one last time. And in the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a small tan shape. A tent. Exactly where it shouldn't be. I don't remember driving home. I don't even remember unlocking my apartment door. The next thing I really recall is standing in my shower, fully dressed, water pouring over me, cold. I let it run until it stopped being cold. Then I let it run longer. I didn't talk to anyone for 3 days. Didn't check emails, didn't post anything, didn't answer texts. I just sat. Not scared, exactly. More like disconnected. Like I'd stepped out of sync with the world. I kept thinking about the ring, the sound of the zipper, the tent, and mostly about how it was gone, and then it wasn't. By the 4th day, something inside me snapped. Not fear, need. I needed to make sense of it. I needed to be sure. Because the alternative, that I'd imagined it all, felt somehow worse. So I went back. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't pack the full setup. Just a day pack, flashlight, knife, some energy bars. No tent. No sleeping bag. I wasn't planning to stay the night. The hike felt different this time. Sehr heavier. Like the trees were leaning in just a bit more than they should. I kept checking behind me, certain I'd hear footsteps, see someone. Nothing. When I reached the clearing, I froze. It was exactly as I'd left it. Fire pit cold. Flattened grass where my tent had been. No Ottersins of life. And no tent. Still, I didn't move for several minutes. I stood at the edge of the clearing, letting my ears adjust. Listening. The birds were back. The stream still trickled in the distance. But the wind felt wrong. Not stronger or luder. Just present somehow. Like it was watching me. I stepped into the clearing. Walked down to the stream. No footprints. No ring. Nothing. But as I turned back toward the tree line, I noticed something strange in the dirt. A circle. Pressed faintly into the soil, maybe 5 feet wide. Like something had sat there for a while. Heavy. Round. A tent. I dropped to one knee and ran my hand over the outline. The edges were shallow, but real. I hadn't imagined. Something had been there. Recently. My stomach turned. I stood up fast, heart hammering, and that's when I saw it. Something white. Stuffed into the crook of a tree trunk, about 10 feet away. I approached cautiously. It was a photograph. Curled slightly at the edges, black and white. Grainy.
A photo of me. Sitting at the fire pit. From my last trip.
Taken from a distance, maybe 50 feet away. The angle, it matched the direction of that missing tent. I stood there staring, mouth dry, trying to process. It wasn't possible. I hadn't brought a camera. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't even heard a drone. I flipped it over. There was something written on the back, in faint pencil, "You missed something." I turned slowly in a full circle, every muscle in my body clenched. My breathing felt shallow. I was being watched. I knew it. But the forest looked the same. Still. Quiet. Too quiet. I started backing up toward the trail. I didn't run, not yet. I wanted to. But some instinct told me not to make sudden movements.
Like a dog sensing tension in the room.
As I reached the edge of the clearing, something caught my eye in the brush to the left. A second photograph, tucked between two branches.
Another one of me.
Sleeping.
Inside my tent.
The angle, it had to have been taken through the flap. I didn't remember unzipping it that night. I didn't take the photo. I didn't even want to touch it. But I did. On the back, just 2 words.
Still hier.
That's when I ran. I didn't follow the trail.
I crashe trug the woods in a blind panic. Brausche slapping my face, roots grabbing at my ankles.
I don't know how I didn't fall.
Adrenaline. Maibe.
Terror like I'd never felt before. I didn't stop running until I saw the glint of my car through the trees.
I drove straight home.
Didn't stop. Didn't look back. That night, I locked every door, every window.
Closet were blind. Slept with the lights on. Not that I slept.
The next morning, there was a package on my doormat.
No return address. Just my name. Inside, 3 photos. All black and white.
All recent.
The first, me, running through the trees. Face blue-red by moonshine. The second, me, asleep in my bed.
Last night's clothes still on.
The third, my apartment door.
From the hallway.
Just before dawn. No notice this time.
But something was paperclipped to the third photo.
The same metal ring.
I didn't leave my apartment for a week after that. I lived like a shut-in, phone off, curtains drawn, locks changed. I sealed the mailbox shut with duct tape.
Scraped a metal plate over the mail slot in my door. I slept on the floor, in the corner of my bedroom, back to the wall. Kitchen kniefe wie Tenrich.
Every night, I checked every part of the apartment.
The closets.
The shower.
Behind the curtains.
Under the bed, even though I didn't sleep in it anymore. I told myself if I just stayed inside long enough, whoever, or whatever, this would get bored. Move on. But on the third night, I realized, it wasn't outside anymore. I had drifted off in the corner, flashlight still in my lap, when a sound pulled me back to consciousness. Click. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The dry, mechanical click of a light switch. I opened my eyes. The room was dark, but my hallway light was on. I hadn't turned it on. I sat perfectly still, heart pounding, every part of me rigid with panic. I tried to listen, truly listen, but the blood rushing in my ears made it impossible to tell if anyone was moving. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I forced myself to crawl to the door and press my ear against it. Silence. Then very faintly, a soft rustling, like clothes brushing a wall, followed by the low creak of a floorboard.
Some were inside the apartment.
I didn't move. Not because I was frozen, but because I knew if I made a sound, whoever was out there would know exactly where I was. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the hallway light clicked off again.
Darkness. I held my breath so long my vision blurred.
My hand gripped the flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I must have passed out from stress or fear, because when I opened my eyes again, morning light was spilling in through the curtains. The hallway light was off. The apartment was quiet. Nothing looked disturbed. Except, on the center of my coffee table, placed neatly on top of a black and white photograph, was my flashlight. I hadn't left it there. The photo underneath was of me, asleep, in the exact position I'd been in the night before. But this time, it wasn't taken from outside. It wasn't through a tent flap, or across a forest. This one was taken from above, from inside the apartment. The camera had been right there, pointed down at me. I don't remember dropping the photo, or the flashlight.
I remember standing in the middle of the room.
sweating, shaking. And then I noticed something else. Taped to the back of the photo, barely visible under the edge, was a note. Handwritten in thin, scratchy pencil.
5 words. Let's go camping again soon.
Story 2. By Daniel. Camping had always been more her thing than mine. Claire was the one who craved nature, who spent her childhood summers in cabins, collecting pine cones and learning to build fires. Me? I was a city kid. The outdoors was just a thing I tolerated to make her happy. And when she suggested a long weekend in the Pine Creek Reserve, no cell service, no electricity, real off-grid wilderness, I hesitated. But it had been a stressful couple of months. Work had burned me out, and she knew it. So I said yes. We drove 6 hours out from the city, loaded down with more gear than we needed. The last hour was nothing but dirt roads and switchbacks, the kind that made your suspension scream. By the time we reached the designated parking area, it was already late afternoon. From there, we had to hike another 45 minutes down a trail marked only by faded orange tape and the occasional worn signpost. Our site was gorgeous. Nestled between 2 hills, with a narrow creek running behind the trees, and just enough of a clearing to pitch the tent and build a fire. We didn't see a single soul on the hike in. It was perfect. Quiet. Maybe too quiet. The first night passed without issue. We set up the tent, cooked a couple of foil meals over the fire, and watched the stars until we dozed off. The only strange thing was how quiet the woods were. I'd expected bugs, frogs, owls, something. But it was just still. No big deal, I told myself. On the second day, around 6 p.m., we were returning to the camp after gathering kindling when Claire stopped walking. Do you see that? I followed her gaze to the path ahead. There, standing just off the trail, was a boy. Maybe 7 or 8 years old. Blonde hair, a little messy. Dressed in a gray t-shirt and shorts. His arms hung limp at his sides, and he was barefoot.
No backpack.
No adult. Just him. Standing there, completely silent. Claire whispered, "Where's his family?" I didn't answer. I stepped forward a bit and raised a hand. "Hey there, buddy. You okay?" The boy didn't respond. He didn't move at all. His eyes were wide, and they tracked me, but he said nothing.
No blink.
Just stared. I took another cautious step forward. "Are you lost? We can help." Still nothing. His chest rose and fell slowly, like he wasn't even nervous. Like we weren't even there. Claire gently pulled at my arm. "Something's wrong." I nodded, but I didn't know what to do. We couldn't just leave him. But he wouldn't respond. And something about the way he stood there, completely still, put my nerves on edge. Eventually, I crouched down and tried again. "Are your parents nearby?" His eyes didn't flicker. But now that I was closer, I noticed something odd. His feet were filthy. Like he'd been walking barefoot a long time. There were faint scratches on his arms. And something else, his shirt was inside out. It was such a small detail, but it struck me. Kids don't usually dress like that unless they're in a rush. Or unless no one's helping them. I stood up. Claire whispered, "Maybe he wandered off from another campsite?" "There are no other sites around here. We haven't seen anyone." We stood there awkwardly for another minute. Then the boy finally moved. He turned around, slowly, and walked into the woods. No glance back.
No rush.
Just a slow, deliberate walk, vanishing behind the trees. Should we follow him? Claire asked. I don't know. Everything in me said no. Something wasn't right. But leaving him felt wrong too. We argued for a moment, quietly, urgently, but in the end, we didn't follow. We made a plan. If we saw him again, or if he came back, we'd try to find help. Maybe we'd run into a ranger. Maybe someone else would be hiking nearby. That night, Claire barely slept. I kept the flashlight on most of the night, scanning the trees. But the boy didn't come back. The next day, we decided to take a trail that looped around the small ridge behind our camp, just to see if maybe there were signs of where the boy had gone. I didn't tell Claire, but I kept looking for little things. Broken branches, shoe prints, candy wrappers, anything. We found nothing. But when we returned to the camp later that afternoon, Claire froze again. He was there. Standing across the creek this time, maybe 20 feet away. Staring at us through the trees. Same expression. Same stance. I stepped toward him and called out again. "Are you okay? Do you need food? Water?" No answer. I waded through the creek, slow and careful, but as I stepped onto the bank, he was gone. Just gone. Like he'd vanished between one blink and the next. I scanned the woods. Nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the breeze pushing the tall grass. That night, I didn't sleep. Claire and I sat in silence around the dying fire, both pretending to read. Neither of us said it, but we were scared. Not terrified, but unsettled. Like the air itself was pressing down on us. At some point in the night, I must have dozed off inside the tent. I woke up suddenly. Not to a sound, but to the absence of one. Claire wasn't beside me. I shot up, heart pounding, and unzipped the tent. She was standing just outside barefoot, in her pajama pants and hoodie, facing the trees. I stepped up behind her. Claire. She didn't turn around. What are you doing? She pointed. Across the clearing, half hidden behind a tree, was the boy. Closer than ever. Claire whispered, "He's been watching us for an hour." I couldn't speak. He didn't move. Just stared. The moonlight caught his eyes, and for a second, they didn't even look real. Just flat and distant. "I think we should go," she said quietly. "Now."
No.
"In the morning. As soon as the sun comes up." I nodded. We didn't go back to sleep. We sat in the tent with the light on, backs to each other, waiting for the dark to lift. When morning came, the boy was gone. We packed everything in silence. Halfway through the hike back to the car, we ran into a man in a ranger's uniform, checking the trail. His name was Mike. Older guy, maybe 50s, clearly surprised to see us. "You two camping out here alone?" I nodded. Claire was silent. "Anyone else with you?" I hesitated, then said, "We saw a kid out here. Looked about 8. Alone. We tried talking to him, but he wouldn't respond. He was just watching us." Mike raised an eyebrow. "When did you see him?" "Yesterday. And the day before." He frowned. "Nobody's reported a missing kid in this area. Not for weeks." He was barefoot. Dirty. Something was off. Mike paused. Was he talking at all?
No.
Never said a word. The ranger scratched his beard. "That's strange. You say he was alone both times." I nodded again. "Well, if you see anything else, let me know. Sometimes folks come in from private land nearby. They let their kids run wild out there. Still, we don't usually get kids wandering this deep." He gave us a card. Just a phone number. No name on it. We didn't say much after that. Just kept walking. When we got back to the car, I felt a huge weight lift. Like the world had color again. Movement. Noise. We didn't talk much on the drive back. That night, we got home and unloaded everything. I put the gear away, dumped the dirty clothes in the laundry, and sat on the couch with a beer. Claire said she was going to shower. When she came out 20 minutes later, she was pale. She held her phone in one hand. "I was going through the photos," she said, "from the trip." I set my beer down. She handed me her phone. There were maybe 40 photos. Shots of trees, the tent, our fire, some selfies, a close-up of the creek. And then, one photo taken from behind the tent. Looking toward us. We're both in frame. Sitting at the fire. But we didn't take it. It was shot from a low angle, like someone crouching just behind the trees. I swiped again. Another photo. This time closer. Claire and I, sleeping in the tent. Our outlines visible through the mesh window. Taken at night. Flash off. Just the dim glow of our lantern lighting our faces. I could barely breathe. The last photo showed the two of us, hiking back to the car. Taken from behind. From the trail. Claire looked at me and whispered, "How long was he watching us?" I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. And because deep down, I was afraid the answer was, the whole time. We didn't sleep that night. The pictures were too much. There's something about seeing yourself, your unguarded self, captured by a stranger that breaks a part of your brain. It makes the world feel thinner. Like a curtain has been pulled back, just for a second, to show you how exposed you really are. Claire cried quietly in the kitchen. I sat on the couch, phone in hand, scrolling through the photos over and over, trying to find something I hadn't noticed. A reflection. A shadow. Anything. But there was nothing. Just us. Caught mid-moment. Laughing. Eating. Sleeping. Watched. We didn't talk much the next morning. We were both raw. She left to stay with her sister for a few days. I didn't stop her. I think we both needed space. That night, I stayed up late, unable to shake the feeling that there was still something wrong. I kept checking the window. Double-checked the door lock. Slept with the light on. Around 3 a.m., I got up to get a glass of water. As I walked past the living room, I stopped. The curtains were slightly open. Just an inch. I hadn't left them that way. I stood still for a long time, staring at the gap. Then slowly, I walked over and pulled the curtain fully open. There was nothing there. Just the empty street. A quiet sidewalk. Stillness. I let out a shaky breath. When I turned around to go back to bed, I saw it. A piece of paper. Lying on the doormat, just inside the door. I hadn't heard anything.
No knock. No footsteps.
No creak of the door hinge. But the paper was there. Folded once. Perfectly centered. I picked it up, hands trembling.
No envelope.
No writing on the outside. Inside was a single printed photo. Black and white. Of me, standing in front of the window. Taken seconds ago, from the outside. I was frozen in the frame, face half turned, staring into the night. On the back, in neat, childlike handwriting, "You saw me first." Story 3. By Ryan. There's a difference between being alone and being isolated. When you're alone, you still feel connected to the world. You can hear a car in the distance, planes overhead, maybe the hum of electricity in the air. But when you're isolated, it's different. There's no sound, no movement, no signal. You feel like the last person left alive. That's how it felt at Pineglass Lake. It was late October, just before the weather turned. Cold enough that the bugs were gone, but not so cold you'd freeze overnight. I had a few days off work, and my friends Eric and Mason were in between jobs. We figured it was the perfect time to disappear into the woods for a long weekend of beer, fire, and dumb conversations. We chose Pineglass because it was hard to reach. You had to hike 6 miles with gear from the nearest dirt road.
No boats. No campsites.
Just a glacial lake tucked into the hills, surrounded by thick pine forest and cliffs on 3 sides. A natural bowl. No cell service. No rangers. No people. Perfect. The first day was uneventful. We reached the lake around 2 p.m., found a flat spot a few hundred feet from the shore, and pitched 2 tents. We collected firewood, cracked some beers, and watched the light fade over the water. That's when Mason noticed it. "Hey," he said, pointing across the lake. "What's that over there?" We looked. On the far shore, maybe a quarter mile away, tucked into the trees, was a cabin. Old. Slanted. No visible path leading to it. It looked like it had been there forever, forgotten by time. We hadn't noticed it during the hike in, but from this angle, across the water, it was clear as day. "There's no trail on that side," Eric said. "Maybe it's private land?" I offered. "Maybe," Mason said. "Looks abandoned though." We stared at it for a while. No signs of life.
No chimney smoke.
No movement. Eventually, we let it go. Night came quickly. We cooked some sausages, drank more than we should have, and passed out under the stars. The next day, we hiked around the lake. It was mostly steep cliffs and tangled roots, so we didn't get too far. But that cabin stayed in the back of our minds. It was one of those things you don't talk about, but everyone keeps glancing toward. That afternoon, as we were lounging by the water, the light in the cabin came on. We all saw it at once. Just a dim yellow glow from the window. Like a lantern. No movement. No sound. Just light. Eric stood up. "Okay, so it's not abandoned. Must be someone living there after all," I said. "But there's no car.
No dog.
How do they get out here?" We watched for another 20 minutes. Nothing changed. The light stayed on. Eventually, the sun went down. The glow faded. We didn't talk much that night. Something about that cabin made the air feel heavier. Like the woods were listening. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even though I knew it was irrational. The next morning, we found footprints near the edge of our camp. Not ours. These were barefoot. Small. Maybe child-sized. They came out of the woods, stopped just short of Mason's tent, then disappeared back the way they came. "Okay, what the hell?" Mason muttered. Eric laughed it off. "Maybe someone's playing a prank." "Who?" I asked. "We're 6 miles from the nearest road. Nobody's hiking out here barefoot to mess with us." We argued about it for a while. Eventually, Mason said we should go check out the cabin, just to see who was out here. Maybe get some answers. Or at least tell them to stay on their side of the lake. I didn't like the idea, but I didn't object. I think part of me wanted to know too. So we packed up some water, grabbed a machete for cutting through brush, and started walking. It took us over an hour to get around the lake. The terrain was steep and twisted, full of fallen logs and dense undergrowth. No trail. It felt like no one had walked that path in years. When we finally reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping. It was worse up close. The wood was gray and splintered. The door hung crooked on one hinge. There were deep scratches in the frame, like something with claws had raked it over and over. No glass in the windows, just dark empty holes like eye sockets. "Looks abandoned," I said. "Then who turned on the light?" Mason asked. We approached slowly. No sounds inside. No signs of recent use. The door creaked as Eric pushed it open. Inside was one room. Dust everywhere. Rotted floorboards. A rusted-out stove in the corner. A collapsed bed frame. And in the middle of the floor, a notebook. It looked new. Eric picked it up and flipped it open. Most of the pages were blank. But the last few had writing. Handwritten in capital letters, as if scratched in with a dull pencil. The last page read, "You're next." Eric laughed, nervously. "Okay, that's creepy." Mason's face was pale. Someone knew we were coming. I looked around the cabin again. That's when I saw it. A nail on the wall. Clean. With a faint square outline in the dust where something had been hanging. A photo frame, maybe. And directly beneath it, carved into the wood, was a name, Benjamin, October 2004. I don't know why, but seeing that name hit me hard. It made everything feel real in a way nothing else had. We left in silence. The hike back felt longer. Every sound in the forest set me on edge. I kept checking over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone standing there. But the woods were empty. That night, none of us slept. We kept the fire going until sunrise. Mason sat with a notebook in his lap, just staring at it. Eric kept scanning the tree line with his flashlight every few minutes. At one point, I thought I saw movement across the lake. A flicker. A shape. But it was gone before I could say anything. The next morning, we decided to cut the trip short. We packed quickly, not even bothering to clean up. We just wanted to be gone. As we started the hike back, Mason realized something. His journal was missing. He'd been keeping a little leather notebook, writing in it every night. Mostly dumb stuff. What we ate, inside jokes, things we'd seen. He tore through his pack. Nothing. "I had it last night," he said. We searched the area.
No luck.
Eventually, we gave up and left. Back of the car, we threw our gear in the trunk, slammed the doors, and drove. Nobody talked. 2 days later, Mason called me. "You need to see this," he said. He emailed me a photo. It was of a notebook. His notebook. The cover was torn, but I recognized the handwriting inside. The picture had been taken on a wooden floor, splintered and gray. He didn't take the photo. It had been texted to him from an unknown number. No message. No context. Just the picture. He'd already thrown the number into a reverse lookup. It was unregistered. Burner phone, maybe. That night, I couldn't sleep. I pulled up the photos from our trip on my phone. Scrolling through, campfires, the lake, dumb selfies, until I reached the final few. One of them made my stomach drop. It was a wide shot of our camp. Taken from a distance. From the tree line. I hadn't taken it. Neither had Mason or Eric. We were all in frame. Sitting at the fire. Facing each other. But behind us, deep in the shadows between the trees, there was a figure. Barely visible. Just an outline. Too tall to be a child. Standing perfectly still. Watching. The next morning, a manila envelope was taped to my apartment door. Inside were printed photos. 16 of them. All from our trip. Only these were different. Each photo was taken from behind us. From high angles. Low angles. From across the lake. From inside the trees. Some were from the cabin, through the cracks in the wood, looking out at us as we stood by the shore. The last photo was taken at night. We were asleep in our tents. Our fire was dead. The photo was from inside our camp. Whoever took it had been standing only a few feet away. On the back, written in that same blocky handwriting, "One of you is already gone." I didn't go into work the next day. I sat on the couch with the envelope in my lap, flipping through the photos over and over, studying every detail, looking for some clue, any clue, that might explain who took them or how. But there was nothing.
No reflection. No shadow.
No hint of a face. I texted Eric and Mason. Mason responded almost immediately. I got one too. Same kind of envelope. Same handwriting. Different photos. In his, the shots were even closer. One of him brushing his teeth near the lake. One of him sleeping. One, he told me, of him crouched in the woods to pee, taken from only a few feet away. Eric never responded. At first I thought maybe he hadn't seen the message. I waited a few hours. Then I tried calling. No answer. I tried again the next morning. Still nothing. Mason and I debated driving to his apartment. But we didn't. I think we were both afraid of what we might find. 3 days passed. Then, another envelope.
No postie.
No name. Just left at my door like the last one. Inside were 4 photos. All taken after we got back from the trip. One of me walking to the store. One of me sitting at my desk, through the window. One of me sleeping on the couch. And one last photo, taken through the peephole in my front door. I was standing there, holding the previous envelope, looking confused. The caption, scrawled on the back of the final photo, read, "You never left."